Emily Carter thought her family was perfect until one morning, a stranger appeared outside their home. Secrets about her husband, David, began to unravel, pulling the family into a dangerous spiral. When their daughter Sophie was kidnapped, Emily had to step up, confronting betrayal and fighting for love. How far will a mother go to protect her family? Don't miss this gripping family story of love and survival. A crisp autumn morning in Seattle carried with it a gentle coolness, the air tinged with a faint chill. Pale sunlight struggled to pierce through the thin veil of mist, draping the suburban neighborhood in a soft white haze. The world seemed still, save for the distant chirping of birds that punctuated the quiet with traces of life. Inside a modern two-story house, the kitchen glowed warmly with white walls and light oak cabinets. A cluster of pendant lights cast a soothing golden glow over the countertop, where Emily Carter, 35, stood flipping golden brown pancakes in a skillet. A faint smile flickered across her lips as she glanced at her 7-year-old daughter, Sophie, seated at the dining table, pencil in hand, scribbling rough sketches on a sheet of paper. The rhythmic scratching of Sophie's pencil echoed like the ticking of a clock, infusing the morning with a peaceful cadence. But the stillness shattered abruptly with the sharp bark of a dog outside. At first, the sound came in sporadic bursts, but it quickly escalated, growing urgent and tense. Emily paused mid-motion, her brows knitting together. She tilted her head slightly, listening, a vague unease stirring within her. Yet, after a brief moment, she shook it off and returned to her task. Inside the house, the atmosphere remained warm and inviting. Heat radiated from the stove, and the sweet aroma of pancakes lingered in the air. Outside, however, the dog's barking persisted, relentless and unnerving, like an unspoken warning. The stark contrast created an odd rhythm, an uneasy juxtaposition of serenity and the sense that something wasn't quite right, something looming just out of sight. Emily's gaze drifted to the window, where the sheer white curtain fluttered softly. Beyond the glass, the mist had thickened, obscuring her view of the far edge of the garden. A chill swept over her, fleeting but undeniable, as though the morning air, once fresh and reassuring, had turned heavy with a silent, creeping foreboding. Emily flipped a pancake with practiced ease, the motion fluid and familiar, as though she had done it 1,000 times before. The heat from the pan rose gently, casting a warm glow over her face. She turned her head, her gaze softening as she watched Sophie, who was bent over a sheet of white paper, sketching a bird with meticulous focus. The little girl's eyes sparkled with concentration, her small pencil moving rhythmically in her hand. Emily smiling, her voice tender. "What are you drawing, Sophie?" Sophie, without looking up, her voice cheerful. "A bird flying, Mama, but I don't know how to make the wings look pretty." Emily chuckled softly and turned back to the skillet. Yet the warmth of the moment was soon interrupted by the sound of footsteps on the wooden stairs. David appeared, his demeanor tidy but hurried. He wore a pale blue shirt, his tie hastily adjusted as though it had been thrown on at the last second. David descending the stairs, adjusting his cuff. "What time does Sophie need to be at school this morning? I've got a meeting at 8, so you'll have to handle it." Emily paused briefly, setting the pancake onto a plate before turning to face him. Emily, her tone gentle but tinged with meaning. "Why are you always so busy? You came home late last night too. Sophie and I waited for dinner, but you never showed." David hesitated mid-step, moving to the dining table and reaching for the mug of coffee Emily had prepared. His grip on the handle tightened slightly as his eyes flicked toward the window, where pale light filtered in from outside. David hesitant, keeping his tone neutral. "It's just work. You know how it is. This project's at a critical stage." Emily studied him closely, the unease from the dog's barking earlier returning faintly. David avoided her gaze, sipping his coffee instead, his eyes darting to the wall clock. Emily smiling faintly but with emphasis in her voice. "You're still keeping your promise for this weekend, right?
Sophie's been looking forward to the picnic with you.
David set the coffee mug down, the movement a bit too forceful, causing a small splash of liquid to escape. David nodding quickly, his voice slightly strained.
Yeah, of course.
Sophie looked up, her eyes bright with excitement. Sophie.
Daddy, we're going to the park with the ducks, right? I want to bring bread to feed him.
David crouched slightly, forcing a smile, though his gaze remained evasive as he answered. David.
Sure thing, sweetheart. I'll make it happen.
Emily said nothing more, but as David hurried out of the kitchen to get ready for work, her eyes remained fixed on him. A gnawing sense of unease gripped her, his avoidance, the detachment in his words. Her heart felt like the surface of a lake disturbed by an unseen ripple, subtle waves spreading outward in relentless, silent motion. Emily had just finished washing her hands. The faint, clean scent of soap lingered in the air as she dried them off. Suddenly, Sophie's voice rang out from the dining table. The little girl, pencil in hand, froze mid-stroke, the lines on her paper left incomplete. Her wide, round eyes locked onto the window, a blend of wonder and curiosity etched across her young face, as though she had stumbled upon something strange, something profoundly out of place. Sophie, her voice clear, innocent yet strikingly certain.
Mommy, there's someone outside.
Emily spun around, her expression a flash of shock and unease. Her brows furrowed, forming a faint crease on her forehead. She quickly set the dish towel on the counter, hurried but deliberate, then strode toward the window. Gently, she pulled aside the thin white curtain, her tense gaze scanning the backyard with a quiet urgency. Through the misty glass, clouded by the damp morning air, she saw him. A man stood near the fence at the edge of the garden, motionless, almost unnervingly still. He wore a dark coat, his face obscured by a hood that left only the faintest glint of light reflecting off his brow and cheekbones. There was something off about his presence, silent but undeniably deliberate, as if he were observing the house or trying to discern something within it that Emily couldn't yet grasp. Emily, her eyes widening, voice low but sharp, murmuring to herself,
"Who is this man, and what's he doing here?"
Without hesitation, she turned and hurried to the front door. Her fingers gripped the latch firmly, pulling it open in one swift motion. The chill of the morning air rushed inside, biting against her skin. Emily calling out, her voice firm, attempting strength though a faint tremor betrayed her, sharp and demanding.
"Hey, what are you doing here?"
The man flinched slightly, like someone caught in the act. But instead of answering, he remained silent. After a brief pause, he slowly turned his back to her and walked away. His movements were deliberate, his pace quickening, almost evasive. His footsteps barely made a sound on the wet grass, fading into the distance until he disappeared behind the fog that shrouded the street corner. Emily stood frozen on the porch. A rush of heat spread across her face, defying the biting cold surrounding her. Her fingers gripped the wooden railing tightly, so hard that her knuckles turned white. Her sharp, wary eyes tracked the stranger until his shadow was swallowed entirely by the mist, leaving only an unsettling void in his wake. From inside the house, David emerged, his gaze darting to Emily before shifting toward the street where the man had vanished. In his hand, he held a mug of steaming coffee, but his grip on the handle was so tense it caused a faint tremor in his fingers. David, his voice low, measured, an attempt at calm masking a trace of unease.
"Probably just someone passing through. You shouldn't worry. This neighborhood is safe. There's nothing to be afraid of."
Emily turned to him, her eyes scrutinizing his face. There was a flicker of something in his tone, a hesitation she couldn't ignore. His gaze didn't entirely meet hers. Emily still facing the window, her voice tinged with suspicion.
"Don't you think it's strange? That man doesn't belong here, and he was just standing there. Why?"
David hesitated. He placed the coffee mug on a nearby side table and forced a smile, though it was thin and unconvincing. "David."
probably lost. You're overthinking this. Don't let it stress you out.
Emily didn't respond. Her eyes lingered on the edge of the garden, where only damp grass and the faint silhouettes of trees remained. Yet unease coiled tighter within her, a nagging sense that the stranger's presence had been far from random. Sophie darted out from the house, her small feet tapping lightly on the wooden floor. In her hand was an unfinished drawing, the paper held slightly askew but still revealing the clear image of a bird mid-flight. She stopped on the porch, lifting her gaze to her mother. Her face held the innocent softness of a child, yet her eyes reflected an unusual seriousness. Sophie, her voice bright but resolute, tilting her head slightly.
Mom, I think I've seen him before. He looks like the man who came to my school the other day.
Emily's head snapped toward her daughter, her eyes widening. Emily kneeling down to Sophie's level, her voice quiet but laced with urgency.
Are you sure, Sophie? Where did you see him?
Sophie nodded, holding out her drawing toward Emily. Her small finger pointed to the hat on the bird in the sketch. Sophie.
He was wearing a hat like this. I remember it was that day he stood near the school gate, looking into the playground when I got out. I thought he was waiting for someone.
Emily felt her chest tighten, a cold shiver running down her spine. Her fingers instinctively clenched Sophie's drawing as a wave of unease swept over her. Rising to her feet, she turned toward David, her gaze sharp with suspicion she could no longer hide. David, who had been standing near Sophie, stepped forward quickly. He placed a hand on the girl's shoulder in what seemed like a casual gesture, but his grip was firm, as if to prevent her from saying more. David, his tone quick, tinged with tension.
Come on, Sophie, you must be mistaken. It's probably just someone passing by. Go back inside. It's cold out here.
Sophie hesitated, her eyes flickering between her parents. But she nodded obediently, turning to head back into the house, leaving the drawing in Emily's trembling hand. Emily remained rooted on the porch, the paper quivering slightly in her grasp. She turned to David, and for the first time she saw a flicker of unease in his expression. His eyes avoided hers, darting instead to the steaming coffee mug he had abandoned earlier. Picking it up, his hands trembled faintly as they encircled the cup. Emily speaking slowly, her voice heavy with doubt.
David, are you sure it was just someone passing by?
David placed the coffee mug down on the small table by the door. He forced a smile, but it was weak, strained, lacking the warmth that once reassured her. David, his voice low, deliberate, but with an undercurrent of reluctance.
You're overthinking it. There's nothing to worry about. Everything's fine.
Emily didn't reply. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, watching his every move, the way his fingers gripped the coffee cup and the way he deliberately stepped inside, leaving her standing alone on the porch. Once David disappeared behind the door, Emily remained frozen in place. Sophie's drawing felt heavier in her hand, and her daughter's words echoed relentlessly in her mind.
He looks like the man who came to my school the other day.
Her thoughts spiraled, tangled in unanswered questions. Who was that man? Why had he been near Sophie's school? And why was David acting so uneasy? A chilling realization crept over her, making her blood run cold. Could David somehow be connected to all of this? Emily drew in a deep breath, her fingers gripping Sophie's drawing so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The weight of the atmosphere around her seemed to press in, suffocating, as a distant sound broke through her thoughts, the sharp, piercing bark of a dog. The barking stretched on, reverberating through the dense fog like a warning she couldn't ignore. Emily stepped back into the house, her movements heavy as though weighted by unnamed thoughts. Sophie's drawing remained in her hand, its simple pencil strokes now carrying an inexplicable sense of unease. She glanced toward David, who stood in the kitchen, busily tidying up. His motions were precise yet awkward, as if trying to mask his own nervousness. As darkness began to settle over Seattle, the fog outside dissipated, giving way to cold winds that wove through the trees. Emily sank into a chair in the living room, the golden light from the overhead lamp failing to dispel the chill that had clung to her since the morning. The house was quiet now, but it was not a peaceful quiet. It was a silence that felt like a pause, a waiting, as though something was on the brink of unfolding. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, causing the leaves to tremble and collide, their rustling an elusive melody of unease. That night, the house was shrouded in an unusual stillness. The living room glowed warmly, the light from the hanging lamp casting a soft sheen on the polished wooden table. Books and framed family photos were neatly arranged on the shelves, exuding an air of familiar tranquility. Yet the stark contrast with the cold darkness of the hallway leading to the bedrooms made the space feel oddly divided. Emily sat in an armchair near the window, her hands resting on her lap, fingers gently tracing the edge of Sophie's drawing. The warm light illuminated her face, creating faint shadows that mirrored the restlessness she could not shake. She cast a glance toward the hallway behind her, where the light didn't reach. The darkness stretched endlessly, like a deep chasm hiding something unspoken. Outside, the wind sighed through the large trees in the yard. Leaves rustled, colliding softly, their sound steady and forlorn, carrying a subtle weight of solitude and unease. Occasionally, the wind paused as if to listen for something, then resumed its whispers, curling around the dry leaves that tumbled across the ground. Shadows from the living room furniture, the low table, the long sofa stretched across the floor, twisting into strange shapes. A candle on the bookshelf flickered faintly, its tiny flame dancing restlessly, as though disturbed by an invisible breeze. Emily's gaze lingered on the warm light of the table lamp, but its glow was insufficient to dispel the cold that crept through her chest. In the hallway's darkness, it felt as though something was moving so faint, it was almost imperceptible, like a fleeting thought that nonetheless sent a shiver through her. She tilted her head, straining to listen in the stifling silence, only to realize that the sound of rustling leaves outside had grown louder, as if drawing closer. The entire house seemed enveloped by an unnamed presence, stretching time and making every second drag on interminably. Emily tightened her grip on the paper in her hand, her eyes fixed on the shadowy expanse of the hallway, sensing an unspoken warning spreading quietly through every corner of the house. Emily slowly rose to her feet, her eyes glancing around the living room bathed in the soft glow of the overhead light. Sophie's drawings were still scattered across the coffee table, with a few sheets lying on the floor in a haphazard mess. On the nearby bookshelf, several books had been shoved out of their usual orderly positions, lending the room a sense of having just emerged from a morning of hurried chaos. Bending down, Emily carefully picked up the loose sheets, smoothing out the crumpled corners with deliberate hands. She stacked the drawings neatly, a faint smile crossing her lips as her gaze lingered on Sophie's sketch of a bird mid-flight. When she reached the last book, precariously perched on the table's edge, her eyes drifted to the corner of the room where David, her husband, often left items from his daily work. A dark coat, one that felt oddly familiar, was draped carelessly over the back of a chair. Emily stepped closer, intending to hang it on the rack near the door. However, as she lifted the coat, something slipped from its pocket and fell to the floor with a soft but unmistakable thud in the quiet room. She bent down slowly, her gaze locking onto the small object that had fallen, a plain white envelope, stark against the dark wood of the floor, as if it had been placed there deliberately to catch her attention. Picking it up, she felt the smooth, thick paper beneath her fingers, a quality she immediately recognized as too fine for ordinary correspondence. Her brow furrowed as her eyes caught the clean, printed text in the upper left corner of the envelope: Northwest Logistics, LLC. Emily's eyes lingered on the name, reading it again and then once more, as though trying to summon some buried memory or meaning tied to it. She turned the envelope over in her hands, her fingers tracing the sealed edge, its precision and firmness fueling her growing suspicion. Her expression darkened, her thoughts spiraling into questions she wasn't ready to answer. What does David have to do with this company? What has he been doing? And why has he never mentioned this name before? Is this related to his work or something far more personal? And why would he keep it in his coat pocket rather than his office? The questions came faster now, swirling like a gathering storm, each one feeding her unease. Unable to suppress her mounting curiosity, Emily brought the envelope closer, her thumb carefully slipping under the sealed edge. Her movements were deliberate, almost hesitant, as if the contents might reveal something she wasn't prepared to face. Pulling out the folded paper, she unfolded it slowly, her eyes narrowing with tension as the printed words came into view. It was an invoice, the type meticulously formatted on crisp, professional-grade paper. But it wasn't the design that took her breath away, it was the figure printed near the bottom, $50,000. Her chest tightened, and she barely registered the note beneath the amount: special transportation services. The words were vague, innocuous on the surface, yet brimming with unsettling ambiguity. The lack of detail only made her anxiety worse. Emily stood frozen, her legs feeling as though they were rooted to the floor. The invoice trembled in her grasp, though there wasn't even the slightest draft in the room. Her fingers shook unconsciously, gripping the paper tightly. Her wide eyes flicked over the numbers again, her lashes trembling as her expression shifted from shock to a sharp, probing intensity. Her mind raced to decode the meaning behind the words that felt harmless at first glance yet left her deeply unsettled. This couldn't be a routine transaction, not the kind she'd ever associated with David's work. Emily murmuring, her voice low, each word deliberate, as if affirming their reality to herself.
What kind of transportation costs this much?
She held the paper closer, the warm light from the desk lamp reflecting off the polished surface, accentuating the bold figures and cryptic note. A chill spread through her chest, icy tendrils creeping outward until she was forced to take a deep breath to steady herself. Emily eased herself into a chair, her movements slow and measured, as though the weight of her thoughts might shatter the fragile calm of the room. Her hands still gripped the envelope and invoice, her eyes fixed on the bafflingly large numbers and the unfamiliar name Northwest Logistics LLC. A strange, unshakable instinct gnawed at the edges of her mind, whispering that this couldn't be a straightforward transaction. Something was being hidden. Outside, the sound of rustling leaves in the wind grew louder, an eerie symphony that seemed to echo the tension building inside her. The sound didn't relent, carrying on as if to remind her that this wasn't something she could ignore. Setting the invoice down on the table, Emily's gaze lingered on the printed logo, her mind repeating the name over and over: Northwest Logistics LLC. She inhaled deeply, her chest rising and falling as she fought to maintain her composure. Even after she let go of the paper, her fingers absently traced the edges of the envelope, as if to imprint the unfamiliar name in her memory. It was a name she had never heard David mention, not once in their 10 years of marriage. A name she now feared would unravel everything she thought she knew about her husband. Emily sat silently in the armchair in the corner of the room, the soft yellow glow of the desk lamp casting uneven patterns of light and shadow across her face, mirroring the turmoil churning within her. She said nothing, her contemplative eyes fixed on the empty space before her, as though trying to piece together a puzzle whose fragments refused to align. The bill remained clenched in her hand, her fingers gripping the edge so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, its whispers blending with the oppressive silence that filled the room. The darkness from the hallway behind her seemed to creep closer, enveloping her in its quiet menace, yet she remained motionless. In her mind, the same questions spiraled endlessly.
What is this service? How is David involved? And why would he hide this from me?
The last candle flickered out as a gentle draft slipped through the window crack, leaving the room bathed in the dim, solitary light of the desk lamp. Emily exhaled deeply, sinking back into the chair, but her thoughts refused to settle. The unease within her was like a small crack, seemingly insignificant at first, yet widening steadily, eroding the trust she once held in David and their marriage. The days that followed passed in a haze of suspicion and guarded vigilance. Emily scrutinized every small action David took, hung on to every word he said, but rather than uncover answers, she only found him drifting further away. David left early and returned late, his excuses always tied to work, yet his evasive eyes and strained smiles deepened her doubts. 2 weeks passed in this way, marked by Seattle's characteristic drizzles, each drop amplifying the gloom and chill that had settled deep within Emily. Tonight was no exception. Darkness blanketed the neighborhood, streetlights shimmering faintly on the wet streaks of water pooled along the road. The house was so still that Emily could hear the steady ticking of the wall clock, its sound slicing through the quiet like a metronome of her unease. Outside, the characteristic drizzle of Seattle fell softly, fine droplets clinging to the wet pavement and forming shimmering streaks that reflected the faint glow of dim streetlights. Dense darkness enveloped the neighborhood, broken only by the weak, golden light spilling from a handful of windows, tiny beacons against the oppressive gloom. The steady patter of rain mingled with the whisper of wind rustling through the large trees in the garden, creating a muted symphony of solitude. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The living room glowed with a warm, amber light from a table lamp perched on a wooden shelf, casting a soft, familiar radiance over the space. The cream-colored sofa, the dark wooden coffee table, and the family photos adorning the walls exuded a coziness that stood in stark contrast to the cold, wet world outside. Emily sat curled up in a large armchair, her legs tucked beneath a thin blanket. In her hands was a thick, hardcover book, but her eyes were not focused on the words. Occasionally, she would turn a page or linger a moment longer than usual, though her mind seemed far away, tethered to some unseen weight pulling at her thoughts. The house was steeped in absolute stillness, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock and the gentle murmur of rain against the windows. It felt as if the world had paused, suspended in an uneasy hush, waiting for something yet to come. The warm glow of the table lamp wrapped around Emily like a fragile cocoon, shielding her from the darkness beyond. But the comfort it offered wasn't enough to quell the quiet unease creeping through her chest, threading its way into her thoughts. Outside, the drizzle and shadows pressed on, encasing the house in an invisible cage of cold and isolation. Emily tore her gaze from the book, lifting her eyes to the large window across the room. Through the fogged glass, she could make out the faint reflections of streetlights flickering on small puddles along the sidewalk. The chill from outside seemed to seep in through every tiny crevice, insinuating itself into the corners of the room and mingling with the intangible dread she couldn't shake. She tightened her grip on the book in her hands before gently setting it down on the coffee table in front of her. Emily drew in a deep breath, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if to ward off an unwelcome thought trying to take root in her mind. The contrast between the warmth of the house and the cold, looming darkness outside cast an unusual tension over everything, an unease that felt almost tangible. Emily sat in the armchair, her fingers idly tracing the hard edges of the book resting on her lap. Her gaze lingered on the printed words on the open page, but her eyes were unfocused, her mind drifting to some indefinite place, filled with hazy, unformed thoughts. Suddenly, the perfect silence of the room was shattered by a knock at the door. It wasn't loud, but in the near absolute stillness, the sound echoed sharply, making everything within Emily freeze. Startled, she loosened her grip, letting the book slide from her lap and onto the chair. A heaviness tightened in her chest, an indescribable unease rising within her, like an invisible warning she couldn't fully comprehend. She picked up the book, placed it carefully on the coffee table, and stood, her movements slow and deliberate, tinged with caution. Her bare feet touched the cold wooden floor, the chill seeping upward through her soles and into her spine, making her shiver involuntarily. Step by careful step, Emily moved toward the dark wooden door, her eyes fixed on it, as if it might somehow reveal who waited on the other side. As she approached, she paused briefly, drawing a deep breath to steady herself. Leaning slightly toward the peephole, she narrowed her eyes, peering through the thick glass. The scene outside appeared blurred under the faint yellow light from the porch lamp. A man stood motionless on the front step, his tall, lean figure cloaked in a dark overcoat that reached his knees, heavy and somehow out of place. The hood of his coat was pulled low, obscuring most of his face, revealing only sharp cheekbones and a defined jawline. The dim light accentuated the harsh angles of his features, making them appear almost spectral. He stood utterly still, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets. Though his stance seemed calm, there was an undeniable menace in the way he carried himself, not from any overt action, but from the cold, oppressive silence surrounding him. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken, her breaths growing short and uneven as her eyes took in the unsettling image. Unable to shake the growing unease, Emily reached for the lock and turned it, but only opened the door a crack just enough to speak to the stranger without fully exposing herself to any potential danger. Emily, her voice cautious, tinged with a faint tremor as she tried to stay composed.
"Who are you? What do you want at this hour?"
The man lifted his head, his cold, piercing eyes gleaming faintly in the shadows as he stared through the narrow opening. His expression didn't change, as though he were calculating something. Stranger, his voice low, deliberate, laced with a faint edge of mockery.
"I need to speak to David Carter. Tell him that if he doesn't deliver the goods on time, we won't be this polite next time."
Emily's expression, the words hit Emily like a blade, sharp and cutting straight through her thoughts. She froze, stunned, unable to respond for several seconds. Her eyes widened, shock and confusion written plainly across her face. She instinctively took a small step back, her hand gripping the edge of the door as though to steady herself. Emily, her voice shaky, almost breaking.
"Who are you? What are you talking about? What goods?"
The man didn't answer. His thin lips pressed into a straight line, withholding any further explanation. He turned away slowly, his movements unhurried yet deliberate, as if confident that his message had been delivered. His posture remained unnervingly composed, but there was something suspicious about his air, as though he knew he held complete control of the situation. His steps echoed lightly on the damp porch, leaving faint marks on the slippery surface. As a cold gust of wind swept through, the hem of his coat billowed slightly, making him look like a phantom disappearing into the rain-drenched darkness. Emily remained behind the door, motionless, her eyes fixed on the retreating figure as it dissolved into the hazy veil of rain and night. A chill gripped her, not just from the cold air seeping in through the doorway, but from the weight of his words, which lingered in her mind, sharp and clear, like a warning wrapped in a threat. Emily slammed the door shut, the harsh sound cutting through the oppressive silence that had blanketed the room moments before. The abrupt noise reverberated through the space, a stark reminder of the strange and unsettling encounter that had just unfolded. Her back pressed firmly against the cold wall behind her, her shoulders trembling in small, uneven rhythms, as if the weight of what had just happened was pressing down on her chest, constricting her breath. Her hands curled tightly into fists, the tension so great that her knuckles turned pale, but Emily didn't even notice. Her mind was too consumed, spiraling into a whirlpool of fear, doubt, and confusion, a chaotic blend of emotions swirling ceaselessly, leaving no room for calm. Her eyes, wide and clouded with unease, darted instinctively around the room, scanning each familiar object as if searching for answers. The gaze swept past the ordinary surroundings but abruptly stopped at the corner of the room, where David's dark coat hung motionless on the wooden rack near the door. The coat, with its natural, unassuming drape, seemed innocuous at first glance. Yet to Emily's heightened and wary senses, it loomed like an ominous symbol, a stark reminder of secrets David might be keeping from her. The memory of the $50,000 invoice she had stumbled upon just days before rushed vividly into her mind. The stark numbers and the phrase "special transportation service" were etched into her thoughts, as if burned there permanently. That image collided sharply with the stranger's cold, knife-edged warning from moments ago.
If he doesn't deliver on time, we won't be this polite next time.
Questions surged in waves, crashing relentlessly through her thoughts, each one more urgent and piercing than the last.
What is David involved in? What is he hiding from me? What delivery? Why hasn't he told me anything? How did things get to this point?
The questions circled her mind, stacking upon one another, growing heavier with each passing second, but no answers emerged to quell the storm. Emily closed her eyes, her lashes quivering as she tried in vain to silence the chaotic flood of thoughts. She took a deep breath, attempting to steady the rapid, shallow rhythm of her breathing, but the sense of unease only grew stronger, enveloping her like an impenetrable shroud. The faint sound of drizzle tapping against the roof outside, the gentle patter of raindrops hitting the porch, blended with the pounding of her heart, intensifying the pressure building within her. She remained frozen, rooted to the spot, as though trapped in place. The darkness in the room seemed to stretch outward with each unsteady breath she took, swallowing her slight figure in its quiet, creeping embrace. The steady ticking of the wall clock echoed faintly from somewhere in the distance, mingling with the soft but relentless dripping of rain outside. In that moment, Emily felt completely isolated, as though the very walls of her home had closed in around her. She was surrounded by an invisible fear, an unnamed dread burrowing deeper into her mind with every passing second. Something was deeply, irrevocably wrong, and she knew, with chilling certainty, that it would not disappear easily. That night, the soft, golden glow of the bedside lamp on David's nightstand cast a faint light, illuminating half of Emily's face as she stood just outside the bedroom door, her hand lightly gripping the wooden frame. The warm light, gentle yet sharp, unintentionally accentuated the determination etched across her features. Her expression was resolute, yet the weariness beneath her slightly shadowed eyes was unmistakable. The rest of the room lay swallowed in deep shadows, revealing only the outline of David as he sat silently on the edge of the bed. Under the muted glow, his figure seemed smaller, lonelier. His hunched shoulders slumped forward, his eyes fixed on the laptop resting on his lap, as if he were trying to shut out the entire world, including Emily. The suffocating stillness of the room was punctuated only by the faint whistling of the wind sneaking through the nearby window and the occasional creak of bare branches rubbing together in the night. The rhythmic clatter of his fingers against the laptop keyboard sounded mechanical, devoid of life, a slow, steady tick-tock, amplifying the unspoken tension hanging between the two of them in the same room. Emily stood motionless for a long moment, her gaze locked on David's silhouette, as if searching for something in the dimness, a reason, an explanation, even the faintest sign that he was still the man she once trusted. But his posture, slouched and withdrawn, and his refusal to look up only deepened the growing chasm between them. The distance, though measured in mere steps, felt immeasurable. Emily stepped into the room, the low heels of her shoes tapping softly against the polished wooden floor. The faint sounds, scattered and hesitant, rang out with startling clarity in the suffocating silence of the space. That tiny noise, so unassuming on its own, seemed to slice through the heavy stillness, thickening the air with tension. In her hand was the crumpled invoice she had found earlier, its creased corners bearing the evidence of her tightly clenched grip, a silent testament to the rage she could no longer contain. Her eyes burned with a cold intensity, sharp and unrelenting like blades cutting through the dim light. They locked onto David, who remained seated on the edge of the bed, motionless. His gaze stayed fixed on the laptop resting on his lap, his fingers moving mechanically across the keyboard, every motion stilted and forced. He was pretending not to notice her presence, as though he could somehow delay the inevitable confrontation she had brought into the room. Emily stopped in the middle of the room. The distance between them was slight, yet it might as well have been a chasm, stretching with the unbearable weight of unspoken words. Slowly, she reached back and pressed her hand against the thick wooden door, then shoved it closed with a sharp force. The sound of its slamming echoed through the room, a dry, metallic crash that vibrated against the walls and shattered the fragile pretense of calm. Without hesitation, she took a few steps closer to David. Her gaze, icy and piercing, never wavered from him. She stopped near the small bedside table, her movements deliberate and unwavering, before slamming the invoice onto the wooden surface with a harsh, resounding thud. The paper struck with a crack that tore through the quiet, silencing the hollow rhythm of David's typing and plunging the room into a suffocating stillness. Emily, her voice low and edged with steel, each word cutting through the air with precise, frigid sharpness.
David, explain. What is this? Who was the man tonight, and what does he want from you?
David flinched at the sudden force in her voice. His shoulders tensed, curling inward slightly as though bracing for a blow. His fingers froze mid-stroke on the keyboard, hovering in midair before slowly lowering to rest, unmoving, on the laptop. He blinked once, a quick, nervous motion, but his eyes remained fixed on the glowing screen. He refused to look at her, his gaze locked onto the monitor like a lifeline, as though focusing on it might save him from the reckoning standing a few feet away. David drew in a long, deep breath, heavy and deliberate, as if trying to steal a few precious seconds before answering. Slowly, he rose to his feet, his movements so measured they bordered on hesitation, as though he were trying to delay the inevitable. Once upright, he turned his back to Emily, directing his gaze toward the shadowed wall in front of him. His arms hung loosely at his sides, but his fingers twitched faintly, trembling with an almost imperceptible motion that betrayed the turmoil of confusion and worry flooding his mind. David drew in a long breath, the sound faint but distinct in the oppressive silence of the room, broken only by the soft whistling of the wind against the window pane. His shoulders, already slumped, sagged further under the weight of the words he knew he had to speak, words that had burdened him for far too long. His hands, hanging limply at his sides, trembled slightly as though unsure where to rest or what to do to steady his nerves. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, his legs rooted in place. After a moment that stretched unbearably, he slowly, almost hesitantly, lifted his gaze to meet Emily's. David, his voice strained, each word dragged out painfully.
At first, it was just a simple job. Really simple, just pick up and deliver a small package. They told me it was classified documents, something that needed to be kept secure and discreet. They paid me well, better than any job I'd ever done, I thought. I thought we needed it. I needed the money to cover the debts, to make sure you and Sophie wouldn't have to worry anymore. It all seemed so reasonable back then, and I thought it would end there.
David paused, raising a hand to his face and running it quickly over his forehead, as if to wipe away images he didn't want to recall. He swallowed hard, his throat moving visibly before his voice returned, lower now, heavier, laced with regret. David, his tone trembling, burdened.
But that organization, it's not just a regular logistics company like I thought. Northwest Logistics is just a front, a name they hide behind. In reality, they're a criminal syndicate running all sorts of illegal operations. Money laundering, smuggling, transporting goods that I don't even dare mention. I didn't know that until I took the second job.
Emily stood frozen, her eyes flashing with cold intensity, sharp like a blade freshly honed. But the coldness quickly gave way to something deeper, a mix of shock and devastation. Her gaze grew conflicted, torn between a desperate need for answers and the refusal to believe the words she was hearing. Emily, her voice cutting, each word like a hiss through gritted teeth.
What did you deliver, David? Did you even know what was inside? Or did you just close your eyes and follow orders?
David gave a small nod, hesitant and barely perceptible, his head still bowed in shame. David, his voice low, barely a whisper.
The first time. I really didn't know. They didn't let me check the package, and I didn't ask. Back then, all I could think about was the money and how it could save us. But the second time...
David's voice caught in his throat, halting briefly before he forced himself to continue. David.
It was a suitcase full of cash. I opened it when they handed it off, and when I realized, I wanted to walk away, but they wouldn't let me. They told me if I didn't cooperate, if I dared to refuse, they'd come after you and Sophie. They'd hurt you both.
Emily took a small step back, her legs trembling beneath her. Her hand rose instinctively to her chest, clutching at it as if the weight of David's confession had physically struck her, stealing the air from her lungs. Emily, her voice shaking, filled with fear and anguish.
Then, who was the man tonight? What did he want from you? Tell me, David.
David dropped his head again, his eyes glued to the floor, as if the answer lay hidden in the wood grain beneath him. His lips pressed into a tight line, the silence between them stretching into an unbearable tension. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, heavy with torment. David, his tone rough, each word dragging painfully.
He's one of their enforcers. They call him Ray. He came here to remind me that the deadline for the delivery had passed and that I still owed them a huge amount, $50,000, money they'd fronted for a shipment I haven't completed. This time, the shipment is much bigger, and if I don't go through with it or pay them back, they won't just threaten anymore.
Emily stood frozen, her entire body stiff with disbelief and horror. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. All she could do was stare at David, the man she had trusted more than anyone else in the world. The wind outside continued to whisper against the window, its mournful sound mingling with the icy stillness inside the room, an omen of darker things yet to come. Emily, her voice weak, trembling with both pain and fury.
You dragged our family into this and didn't even tell me. David, how could you let it go this far?
David clenched his hands into tight fists, his knuckles whitening as he pressed them against his sides. His eyes, filled with anguish and despair, remained downcast, unable to meet hers. David.
I didn't know what to do, Emily. I have no way out. They won't let me go. And now, I'm terrified that if I don't follow through, they'll come for you and Sophie.
His voice trailed off into silence, the weight of his words settling heavily over the room. The faint sound of the wind continued to murmur outside, cold and unyielding, mirroring the chilling tension between them. It was as if the house itself held its breath, bracing for the storm they both knew was coming. Emily took a small step back, her legs trembling uncontrollably, as though all strength had drained from her body, leaving her barely able to stand on the cold wooden floor beneath her. Her eyes, rimmed red, glistened with unshed tears that refused to fall, pooling instead along the edges as if the weight of her pain was too immense, too overwhelming to allow release. Every emotion within her seemed trapped, bottled up tightly in her chest, choking her from the inside out. Her shoulders shook in faint, uneven movements, bearing the heavy burden of her anguish, as though even her body couldn't ignore the depth of her suffering. Slowly, her hand rose to cover her mouth, her fingers trembling, betraying the weakness overtaking her. She bit down gently on her lower lip, desperately trying to suppress the sob building in her throat, a sound she knew, once released, would spiral out of control, unstoppable and all-consuming. Emily, her voice fragile, disjointed, each word heavy with despair and helplessness.
What have you done? And what am I supposed to do now?
The question slipped from her trembling lips, not as an accusation or demand for an answer, but as a stunned confession to herself. It was the kind of question that begged for no reply, a hollow inquiry thrown into the void, an unanswerable plea in the suffocating stillness. Her words, laden with quiet desperation, seeped into the room like a shadow, making the air feel heavier, the silence even more unbearable, as if the space itself was absorbing her grief. David remained silent. He stood frozen, motionless, like a statue, his arms hanging limply at his sides, unsure of what to do or say. His figure was swallowed by the dim, hazy shadows that filled the room, amplifying the isolation and hopelessness encasing him. He bowed his head, his empty gaze fixed on the cold floor beneath his feet, as though seeking some kind of answer in the lifeless grain of the wood. but there was nothing, just emptiness. He couldn't bring himself to look at Emily, couldn't meet her eyes filled with so much pain, disappointment, and unspoken questions. He knew, in that moment, that any explanation he gave, no matter how earnest, would fall flat. He had nothing left to justify, and that knowledge only deepened the guilt weighing down on him. The room fell into a chilling silence, so profound it became almost oppressive. Only the faint rustle of the curtains, stirred by a cold draft sneaking through the slightly open window, broke the stillness. The dim yellow glow of the bedside lamp spilled softly across the room, landing on Emily's frail shoulders, but its warmth did nothing to soothe the icy ache within her. Her silhouette stood there, turned away from David, emanating a sense of profound heartbreak that was beyond words. Her slumped shoulders, weighed down as though carrying the weight of the world, painted a picture of quiet devastation, a poignant image of someone overwhelmed by pain they could no longer bear. Emily said nothing more. Slowly she turned, her steps heavy, each one seemingly more laborious than the last, as though every movement was a battle between anger and sorrow. The yellow light pooled in the space between her and David, but instead of bridging the gap, it only seemed to emphasize the unspoken distance, an invisible chasm that had grown too wide to cross. Outside, the cold wind continued to blow, threading through the cracks in the window, its faint howls carrying an eerie, almost cruel whisper, a reminder that the rift between them was not confined to this room, but lived deep within their hearts. Emily walked slowly out of the room, her slender shoulders sagging under the weight of the words she had just heard, as though they had crushed the last vestiges of her strength. Yet amidst the sorrow, anger, and despair, a shadow of fear began creeping into her thoughts. Would those men stop at threats? What else was David hiding from her? This newfound dread curled tightly around her chest, gripping her like a vice. She paused in the dimly lit hallway, staring at the large window at its far end. The darkness beyond seemed impossibly thick, like a shroud covering a world slipping further and further out of her control. The instinctive, protective pull of motherhood surged within her, drawing her thoughts to Sophie and her daughter's safety. The nameless fear rose sharply within her, and she clenched her fists tightly, as though bracing herself against the unknown storm that lay ahead. Inside the house, the golden glow of the lamps illuminated every corner, wrapping the space in a sense of warmth and familiarity. Emily stood in the kitchen, her hand gently stirring a pot of steaming soup, the aroma filling the air and weaving a tranquil, everyday comfort into the atmosphere. The steady ticking of the wall clock blended seamlessly with the soft clinks of kitchen utensils. In the living room, Sophie sat on the floor, surrounded by scraps of paper and her beloved colored pencils. Her small figure radiated pure concentration, her bright eyes sparkling with the simple joy of creation. Every now and then, Emily glanced over at her daughter, a faint smile tugging at her lips, a fleeting solace amid the tangled knots of worry in her heart. But outside, a black veil of night had descended, enveloping the neighborhood in its suffocating grip. The faint glow of the streetlights was powerless against the thick darkness that pooled in the yards and cloaked the winding paths. The cold wind whispered incessantly through the trees, its eerie murmur carrying a foreboding weight, as though the night itself harbored a hidden menace, lurking, waiting. Emily didn't yet know that in just a few minutes, the fragile peace she clung to would shatter completely. It would begin with a piercing scream from Sophie, a sound that would change everything. The golden light from the overhead lamps and bedside fixtures filtered softly through the house, creating an inviting, secure space. In the kitchen, the comforting scent of chicken soup simmering on the stove mingled with the rhythmic sound of a wooden spoon stirring the pot, a melody of domestic routine. Emily stood over the stove, her movements brisk yet serene, her hands skillfully tending to the remaining ingredients. The occasional clatter of a knife against the cutting board punctuated the low crackle of the flame beneath the pot. From the living room, Sophie's light laughter rang out, pure and unguarded, a beam of brightness piercing the weight in Emily's chest. The little girl sat on a large rug in the center of the room, her world surrounded by colored pencils and bright pages filled with her vibrant drawings. Each completed picture brought a burst of delight, her eyes shimmering with the uncomplicated happiness that only a child can find in small, wondrous moments. But outside, the scene was starkly different. Darkness blanketed everything, heavy and still, like an invisible shroud draped over the neighborhood. The dim glow of the streetlights barely penetrated the night, their beams reflecting faintly off thin layers of mist drifting lazily across the yard. The darkness pressed closer, brushing against the house like a silent intruder, casting vague, ominous shadows on the curtains. The wind began to howl with greater force, bringing with it sharp gusts that rattled the window panes. The faint clack sounds a chilling reminder of the world beyond the fragile walls. Emily's head lifted at the noise, her eyes flicking toward the kitchen window, where the dense black of the night pressed against the glass. Outside, a faint sound, a single footstep cut through the wind, so light it almost went unnoticed. But it was enough to make Emily pause. Her fingers tightened instinctively around the wooden spoon, her eyes momentarily clouded with unease. In the living room, Sophie remained immersed in her little world, her laughter ringing out, filling the house with a deceptive sense of calm. It felt as though her innocent joy could dissolve any unease, but within Emily, a vague uneasiness began to stir, a feeling without reason but impossible to ignore. The darkness outside seemed to creep closer, its inky tendrils clinging to the edges of the house, pressing against its walls. It was more than just a part of the night, it felt alive, a watchful presence poised to break through and obliterate the fragile peace of this moment. The fragile silence of the house was shattered by the violent crash of the back door being flung open. The sharp, metallic screech of its hinges, paired with the loud thud of wood slamming against the wall, echoed through the kitchen, tearing apart the thin veneer of peace. A rush of cold wind swept inside like a small storm, carrying the dampness of the night and the oppressive weight of darkness, filling the room with an ominous, suffocating air. 3 masked men stormed through the open doorway, their movements swift and calculated, radiating a precision that suggested careful planning. Leading them was a towering figure, a broad-shouldered, muscular man whose powerful frame was evident even beneath his dark jacket. He moved like a steel fortress, each heavy footstep on the tiled floor reverberating through the space, exuding an aura of dominance and unmistakable menace. Behind him were 2 slightly shorter but equally imposing figures, their broad shoulders and solid builds a testament to their physical strength. Their movements were practiced and deliberate, each step carrying the unsettling confidence of seasoned predators. Emily, her back turned to the door, was completely unaware of the intrusion. The sudden, jarring sound of the door slamming open jolted her, and she spun around instinctively. Her eyes widened in shock and horror as she took in the sight before her 3 masked men, their faces completely obscured, stepping into her home as though it were their own domain. The wooden spoon Emily had been using to stir the pot of soup slipped from her trembling fingers, clattering loudly onto the tiled floor. The sharp sound cut through the tense atmosphere like a warning bell, echoing with a chilling finality. Emily froze where she stood, her body rigid as stone. In that moment she was paralyzed, her mind struggling to process the nightmare unfolding before her. Every instinct screamed at her to move, to act, but she couldn't. All she could do was stare at the intruders with wide, terrified eyes, unable to believe what she was seeing. Before Emily could recover, the leader of the group lunged toward her with the speed and force of a predator closing in on its prey. His massive hands seized her wrists in a brutal grip, twisting them as he forced her to her knees. Emily crumpled onto the cold, hard tiles, a sharp pain shooting through her knees on impact. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the wave of panic and dread surging through her. Emily, her voice breaking, choked with panic, each word a desperate plea.
"What do you want? Please, don't hurt her. Don't hurt Sophie."
Her voice pierced the heavy air, a cry of raw desperation that seemed to amplify the oppressive tension in the kitchen. Her frantic gaze darted toward the living room, where Sophie was still playing, oblivious to the terror closing in. Emily's heart clenched painfully, but everything was happening too fast for her to act. The other two men wasted no time, striding purposefully toward the living room. Sophie, seated on a large rug, was engrossed in coloring a bright, cheerful picture. The sound of the commotion and her mother's frantic cry made her look up, startled. For a brief moment, Sophie's innocent eyes reflected confusion, but it was quickly replaced by terror as the two masked men charged toward her like hunters closing in on their prey. Before Sophie could react, before she could scream or run, one of the men grabbed her roughly with a hand that seemed too large, too strong for her tiny frame. Sophie screaming, her voice high-pitched, filled with raw fear.
"Mommy, Mommy, help me!"
She flailed wildly, her small arms flapping in desperate defiance. But the strength of the man holding her was overwhelming. Her futile struggle was no match for the iron grip that pinned her in place. The second man moved quickly, clamping a massive hand over Sophie's mouth. Her terrified screams were abruptly muffled, reduced to weak, stifled cries that echoed faintly through the house like the haunting remnants of a child's plea. In the kitchen, the leader of the group kept Emily pinned firmly, giving her no chance to fight back. He crouched down, his masked face inches from hers. Through the narrow slits of his mask, his cold, emotionless eyes bore into hers, an icy reminder of the power he wielded. Leader, his voice deep, deliberate, chilling, every word like a blade.
"Tell David he has exactly 1 hour to bring the money to the warehouse on the north side of the city. If he doesn't, you'll never see your daughter again."
With those words, he tightened his grip on Emily's arms one final time, a cruel, silent punctuation to his threat. Then, with a violent shove, he pushed her down onto the tiles. Emily collapsed, her hands trembling as they struggled to support her weight against the cold, unyielding floor. The leader stood upright, his body like a cold, unfeeling statue amid the chaos that filled the space. Through the narrow slits of his mask, his icy eyes glinted, their frigid gaze cutting into Emily, making her feel as though every drop of blood in her veins had frozen solid. He cast one last glance at her, a silent warning etched into his expression, a wordless command not to resist, not to dare any foolishness. Then, after a moment that felt unbearably long, he raised his leg and delivered a brutal kick to Emily's shoulder. The force sent her sprawling to the kitchen floor, her body collapsing with a merciless thud. Her knees struck the cold tiles with a sickening crack, and sharp pain radiated instantly through her legs, surging up her spine. But even that physical agony, searing and immediate as it was, paled in comparison to the suffocating despair that overwhelmed her mind, a chilling tide that threatened to drown her completely. Emily lay sprawled on the floor, her body almost motionless save for the shallow, labored breaths escaping her lips. Just minutes ago, Sophie's bright, joyful laughter had echoed through the house, a memory now distant and aching, as though it belonged to another life. That fleeting happiness was replaced by the haunting image of those cold figures disappearing out the back door, Sophie in their grasp. A split second later, the back door slammed shut with a jarring, final sound, reverberating through the kitchen like the death knell of every fragile hope Emily had held onto. In that moment, the kitchen descended into an eerie silence, the kind that felt heavy and oppressive, not just from the emptiness of the space, but from the shattering of Emily's spirit. The faint whistle of the cold wind slipped through the gap in the window, its lonely sound blending with Emily's ragged breathing, a discordant symphony of despair. She lay there, her eyes wide open, blank and glazed with terror. She couldn't move, couldn't think. Every nerve in her body had been numbed by the all-consuming grip of fear. Hot tears rolled down Emily's cheeks, falling onto the cold tile floor, where they disappeared almost instantly, leaving behind faint, damp traces ephemeral evidence of her profound helplessness and grief. Outside, the hum of an engine pierced the stillness, its rhythm steady but growing fainter with each passing second, like the retreating footsteps of hope itself. They were gone, and they had taken Sophie with them. The sound of the vehicle faded into the distance, but in Emily's mind, it echoed endlessly, a cruel reminder of her utter powerlessness. All she could do was lie there and replay the moment in her head, the moment she had failed to stop them, failed to protect her daughter. The kitchen, once the warmest and most familiar part of the house, now resembled a battlefield in ruin. The dim light from the overhead fixture cast weak, uneven shadows, unable to dispel the suffocating darkness that clung to every corner. Shattered dishes littered the floor, fragments of porcelain catching the faint light, reflecting the chaos and heartbreak that had overtaken the space. Emily tried to push herself up from the floor, her hands trembling uncontrollably, unable to summon the strength to lift her weight. Her entire body felt drained, every ounce of energy consumed by the crushing weight of pain and despair. Her voice broke through the silence, faint and trembling, barely audible even to herself. Emily whispering, choking on her words, as though speaking to no one.
"Sophie, what? What am I supposed to do now?"
The anguished words hung in the air, mingling with the steady ticking of the wall clock, a relentless reminder that time, cruel and unyielding, would not stop for her grief. 1 hour. She had one precious hour to achieve what felt impossible. Emily raised her gaze, her tear-filled eyes glistening in the dim light. But amidst the blur of despair, a flicker of determination began to spark, small, fragile, but undeniably present. It burned faintly at first, growing brighter with each passing second. She knew, with unwavering clarity, that no matter what she had to face, no matter the cost, she would not let Sophie remain in their hands. Emily lay motionless on the cold, unforgiving kitchen floor, her wide eyes staring blankly at the void above her. The chaos in her mind was relentless, a storm of fragmented thoughts and overwhelming dread. The silence in the house was so profound that the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock echoed clearly, an unyielding reminder that every second slipping by was a precious moment she couldn't afford to lose. Each tick felt like an invisible blade, piercing deeper into her consciousness, hammering home the cruel reality that time was marching forward while her daughter was being taken farther and farther away. Her gaze shifted slowly, drifting from the ceiling to the scene around her, the icy tiles, shards of broken ceramic scattered across the floor, and the muted golden glow of the overhead light reflected in the fractured surface. She exhaled heavily, the sound mingling with the oppressive stillness, as if dragging out the last remnants of strength from her weary body. With immense effort, Emily began to move, each motion burdened with the weight of the world. Her trembling hands reached for the edge of the kitchen counter to pull herself up, but her fingers slipped against the smooth wood, unable to find a firm hold. She tried again, gripping harder this time, and finally managed to rise, though her legs wobbled beneath her, refusing to fully support her. Her eyes wandered aimlessly at first, unfocused and vacant. But as she lifted her head, her gaze fell, almost by instinct, on a small picture frame sitting carefully on the kitchen counter. The family photo within it seemed to call to her, drawing her closer. In the photo, Sophie stood in the center, her bright eyes sparkling like rare gems, her radiant smile lighting up the image with pure innocence and joy. Beside her, Emily and David stood close together, their expressions glowing with a simple yet genuine happiness. The sight of that photo struck Emily like a blade through the heart. She took a halting step toward it, then another, her movements heavy and deliberate. The tears that had dried on her cheeks began to flow once more, hot and unstoppable, each drop carrying the raw anguish and helplessness that consumed her. She reached out with shaking hands, picking up the frame and holding it tightly, as if it were the only tether left between her and Sophie. her tear-filled eyes locked onto her daughter's smiling face in the photo, the overwhelming ache in her chest making it nearly impossible to breathe. The tears slid down her cheeks, falling onto her trembling hands and leaving faint, shimmering streaks on the glass surface of the frame. Emily whispering, her voice fractured, each word a plea steeped in sorrow.
"Sophie, I'm so sorry I let this happen."
But then, something shifted in her eyes. The despair and panic that had consumed her began to give way to something else, a flicker of resolve, faint but unyielding. From deep within her shattered heart, a spark ignited, small but fierce. Determination flooded her gaze, pushing away the hopelessness that had threatened to drown her. Emily carefully placed the frame back on the counter, treating it with the reverence of a sacred promise. She wiped her tears away with the back of her hand, the gesture firm and resolute. Though her eyes remained red and swollen, the frailty in her expression was gone. In its place was a steely resolve, a strength born from desperation and love. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her knuckles turning white as she gripped tightly, channeling every ounce of her will into that single gesture. Her body trembled not with fear or exhaustion, but with the raw intensity of her newfound determination. Emily, her voice trembling but resolute, each word carrying the weight of an unbreakable vow.
"I will save you, I promise."
Slowly, Emily straightened her posture, standing taller than before, her frame no longer bowed under the weight of despair. The soft glow from the family photo reflected faintly on the polished wooden counter, forming a small, steady light that stood out against the somber shadows of the room. She stared at the light for a few more seconds, as if drawing strength from its faint glow. Taking a deep breath, Emily clenched her fists tighter. She knew that time would not wait, and she no longer had the luxury of fear or hesitation. This time, no matter what she had to face or what price she would have to pay, she was determined to do whatever it took to bring Sophie home. The air inside the house remained thick and suffocating, as though time itself had come to a grinding halt. No sound broke the silence, except for the relentless ticking of the wall clock. Each tick was a cruel reminder of the passing seconds, underscoring the unforgiving truth that time waits for no one, not even those crushed under the weight of unbearable pain. Emily sat in a chair in the middle of the living room, her small figure swallowed by the darkness that cloaked the space. Her hands clutched a framed family photo, holding it close as if it were the only thing keeping her from falling apart entirely. Her gaze was fixed on the front door, where she had been waiting, hoping for David's return. Her eyes were red and swollen, her tears long spent, but deep within them burned a flicker of unyielding determination, a fragile but unbreakable flame. Suddenly, the front door burst open with a harsh, jarring sound that shattered the oppressive stillness. A cold gust of wind swept in, carrying with it dried leaves from outside, and the sound of hurried footsteps echoed against the wooden floor. David stumbled into the room, disheveled and frantic, his coat askew and his shoulders stiff, as though he were bearing the weight of the entire world. His face was ashen, almost unrecognizable, as if every ounce of life had been drained from his body. David's bloodshot eyes darted around, wild with fear and desperation. When they landed on Emily, he froze, his entire body going rigid. He stood there, speechless, as though the cold, unyielding expression on her face had stripped him of the ability to move or speak. David, his voice trembling, broken, tinged with fear.
"Emily, what happened? I got the message. What did they do?"
Emily didn't answer immediately. She rose to her feet, her movements slow yet imbued with a quiet authority, as if every step carried the weight of her simmering anger, held tightly beneath a cold, unreadable exterior. Carefully, she placed the family photo on the table, her hand steady even as her gaze remained fixed, sharp as a blade, on David. Emily, her voice steady, cold, each word laced with profound pain.
"You're asking what they did? You know better than anyone, David. You brought them here. You're the one who put Sophie in danger."
Her words, though spoken softly, cut through the air with the force of a dagger, slicing into David's pride and resolve. He staggered back a step, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of her accusation was too much to bear. His hands hung limply at his sides, trembling slightly, as though he couldn't find anything to hold onto to steady himself. David, his voice choked, thick with guilt.
Emily, I didn't know it would come to this. I thought I could control it. I never imagined that they would hurt our family.
Emily stepped closer, her piercing gaze locked onto him, her anger and anguish mingling in a way that made her presence feel almost overwhelming. Emily cutting him off, her voice sharp, every word a needle.
They didn't just hurt our family, David. They took our daughter. Sophie is out there, in their hands, and it's all because of you.
David stood frozen, his legs rooted to the floor, his face drained of all color. Fear and guilt etched deep lines into his features, every inch of him a picture of helplessness. Finally, as though unable to bear the weight of his own failures, he collapsed to his knees, his hands clutching his head, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. David, his voice hoarse, quivering, barely audible.
I'll get her back. I swear, I'll do whatever it takes, anything to bring Sophie home.
Emily stood still for a moment, her gaze unwavering and cold. But deep down, she knew she had no choice but to rely on David. She took a deep, steadying breath, her shoulders trembling lightly as she forced herself to focus on the only thing that mattered now. Emily, her voice firm, resolute.
They gave you 1 hour to bring the money to the warehouse in the north of the city. You know better than anyone who they are and what they want. You need to tell me everything, David. Every detail. If you don't, we won't be able to save Sophie.
David lifted his head, his eyes filled with desperation and reluctant acceptance. He nodded, his hands balling into fists, as if trying to anchor himself against his own guilt. David, his voice heavy, laden with exhaustion and remorse.
They want $50,000. That's the deposit for a shipment I didn't deliver. But it's not just the money. They want to send a message to destroy anyone who crosses them. The warehouse, it's not just for the exchange. It's a trap. If I go alone, they won't let Sophie go.
Emily stared at him intently, her eyes sparking with a fierce determination. She stepped closer, her hands curling into fists, steeling herself for what was to come. Emily, her voice unwavering, resolute.
They don't know me. They aren't expecting me. David, I'm going with you. If we're going to save Sophie, we need to think ahead of them.
David looked at her, startled, but the unyielding resolve in Emily's eyes left no room for argument. He took a deep, shaky breath and nodded in reluctant agreement. David, his voice low, rasping.
All right, but Emily, if things go wrong, you have to promise me you'll leave. Immediately.
Emily clenched her fists, her lips trembling with a mix of anger and fear. She moved toward the kitchen table, where the family photos still lay, a silent reminder of why she couldn't afford to falter. Emily, her voice cold.
I don't care what you've done, David, but I won't let them win. I have a plan, but you need to do exactly as I say.
David furrowed his brow, his shoulders flinching slightly at the firmness in Emily's tone. David, his voice nervous.
Emily, they're people with nothing to lose. If they sense anything's off, Sophie.
Emily cutting him off, her voice sharp as a blade.
You think I don't know that? But if we do nothing, Sophie will never come home. Trust me, David.
Emily left the living room, striding quickly into the small study. She opened an old drawer, rummaging through its contents until she found a dusty backup phone. Switching it on, she dialed a familiar number she never thought she'd need again. Emily, her voice urgent, hushed.
Sarah, it's Emily. I need your help.
On the other end of the line, Sarah was silent for a moment, her breath catching as she heard Emily's voice. Sarah, her voice low, serious.
Emily, are you all right? What's going on?
Emily recounted the situation quickly: Sophie's abduction, the ransom demand, and David's connection to Northwest Logistics. Sarah listened intently, the faint clicking of a keyboard audible as she typed rapidly. Sarah, her voice steady, deliberate.
Northwest Logistics isn't a typical transport company. We've been tracking them for a while. But Emily, you need to understand. This isn't about just handing over money and getting Sophie back. They want to make a statement, and they never let their victims go.
Emily gripped the phone tighter, her eyes blazing with fury. Emily, her voice firm, unyielding.
I don't care who they are. I just need to get Sophie back.
Sarah sighed, but her tone shifted, resolute and commanding. Sarah.
I'll help you, but you have to follow my plan. I'll send a covert team to support you. No one intervenes unless Sophie's life is directly at risk. You'll need a small recording device. I'll guide you on how to use it.
Emily nodded, even though Sarah couldn't see her. Emily whispering.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll do whatever you say.
Emily returned to the living room, where David still sat, guilt etched across his face. She approached him, placing her hand firmly on the table, her piercing gaze locking onto his. Emily, her voice resolute.
I called a friend. She's going to help us. But you need to stick to the plan. No reckless moves.
David frowned, unease flickering in his eyes. David, his voice skeptical.
A friend? Who are you talking about?
Emily shook her head, unwilling to share more details. Emily.
An agent. I can't say much, but she can help without raising suspicion. We'll go to the warehouse, but we're not going empty-handed. And you have to promise me, you won't do anything stupid.
David stared at her, his bloodshot eyes filled with worry, but there was no hesitation in his response. Slowly he nodded, his hands tightening into fists, as though clinging to a shred of hope. David, his voice hoarse, barely above a whisper.
I promise, for Sophie.
Emily straightened, the faint glow of the table lamp casting sharp lines across her face, highlighting the determination and resolve etched into her features. Emily, her voice unwavering.
Then let's go. We don't have much time.
The two of them rose, their shadows stretching across the living room walls under the dim light. Beyond the walls of the house, the darkness outside seemed heavier, thicker, as though it were alive, waiting to swallow them whole. They knew a grueling battle awaited them, but this time they would not fight it alone. The heavy atmosphere inside the house left no room for hesitation or fear. Emily and David, each bearing their own private dread, stepped out into the night. Their once safe haven, the home that had sheltered them, now felt saturated with shadows and painful memories. They moved quickly toward the car, the biting cold of the night wind slicing across their faces, as if intent on extinguishing the faint glimmer of hope they carried. Emily pulled her thin coat tighter around her body, her eyes briefly flicking to her phone, where Sarah had just sent the exact coordinates of the warehouse, along with a final warning. Sarah text message.
We'll be in position, but proceed with extreme caution. There's no room for mistakes. Sophie is
The car roared to life, the engine's growl cutting through the silence of the night. David gripped the steering wheel tightly, his palms damp with sweat, sticking to the leather surface. David, his voice low, waited with unease.
Emily, if there's a chance, let me handle this. You don't have to go too deep into this mess.
Emily, her voice cold, unwavering, her gaze fixed ahead.
This isn't just your fight, David. Sophie is our daughter. I won't stand on the sidelines.
Her words were resolute, leaving no room for argument. The car sped toward the Seattle docks, the dim glow of streetlights illuminating patches of the dark, endless road ahead. As they neared the warehouse, the air turned colder, more ominous. Rows of rusted shipping containers loomed like shadowy giants, stacked haphazardly, their forms distorted by the faint, flickering light. The wind from the sea swept through the area, carrying the damp scent of salt and mildew, adding to the suffocating tension. David parked the car in a secluded spot, just beyond the reach of the warehouse's dim exterior lights. They sat in silence for a moment, the rapid thudding of their hearts filling the stillness. Emily took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the small phone in her pocket, the only link to Sarah and the FBI team monitoring from afar. Emily, her voice steady, her eyes meeting David's.
"Let's go. Sophie's waiting. It's..."
David nodded, but the tension in his eyes betrayed the storm raging within him. As they stepped out of the car, the darkness seemed to close in around them, swallowing the faint glow of the distant streetlights. Together, they moved toward the warehouse, where faint beams of yellow light spilled through high-mounted lamps, casting long, distorted shadows across the cracked concrete floor. The warehouse loomed in the distance, a hulking, decrepit beast lying in wait at the edge of the Seattle docks. The faint, flickering light from overhead lamps barely penetrated the expansive darkness inside, leaving pools of shadow that felt almost alive. The dim glow reflected off damp patches on the floor, creating a surreal, fractured landscape of light and dark. The air inside was thick with the scent of salt and mildew, a heavy, oppressive mix that clung to the walls and the stacks of weathered shipping crates towering overhead. The wind hissed through unseen cracks in the warehouse's structure, a hollow, whispering sound that seemed to echo from every corner like a sinister warning. David stepped forward first, his shoes hitting the damp concrete with a deliberate, echoing clack that reverberated throughout the cavernous space. Each step seemed louder than the last, magnified by the eerie silence, as though the very building was alerting unseen forces to their presence. Emily followed closely, her hand clutching the edge of her coat, her eyes scanning every shadowed corner of the warehouse with sharp, vigilant precision. The stacks of crates created a labyrinthine maze, their imposing forms blocking out what little light managed to filter in from above. Some crates sat open, their mysterious contents spilling out in vague, unrecognizable shapes, heightening the oppressive sense of unease. The dim overhead lights cast a hazy glow, failing to fully illuminate the vast expanse of the warehouse, leaving large sections swallowed by dense shadows. Every corner, every pocket of darkness seemed to harbor an invisible menace, setting Emily's senses on edge. Each breath she took felt heavy, labored, as though the oppressive atmosphere itself was weighing down on her chest. The cold air seeped into their skin, biting deep into their flesh, causing both Emily and David to shiver, whether from the chill or the creeping dread. Neither could tell. From the far end of the warehouse, a faint sound echoed, a metallic scrape, sharp and grating, its jagged notes cutting through the silence like a warning. It was a stark reminder that the darkness wasn't the only thing occupying this space. David stepped cautiously into the warehouse, each of his steps echoing across the empty, frigid space. The black suitcase in his hand gleamed under the faint yellow glow of the overhead lights, their reflections casting distorted streaks across its polished surface. His fingers gripped the handle so tightly that his knuckles turned white, the veins on his wrist standing out like cords stretched to their limit. Though his face was a mask of forced calm, his eyes darted around the cavernous space, searching frantically for the one familiar figure he needed to see: his daughter. In a shadowed corner of the warehouse, Sophie sat huddled on the freezing concrete floor, her small shoulders trembling under the dim light. Coarse ropes bound her wrists and ankles, the fibers digging into her delicate skin and leaving angry red marks. A weak, flickering bulb nearby cast uneven light over her tear-streaked face, illuminating the terror etched into her wide, innocent eyes. She stared at David, her lips quivering as though she wanted to call out to him, but couldn't muster the strength. All she could do was fix her pleading, desperate gaze on him, her look a silent cry for help, clinging to him as her last fragile thread of hope. Surrounding them was a group of men, their imposing figures forming a loose but menacing circle, creating an invisible barrier between David and Sophie. Their dark jackets blended with the shadows, their faces obscured by the uneven flicker of the overhead lights, leaving only their cold, ruthless eyes visible. The leader stepped forward, a towering figure with an air of unshakable authority. His smirk carried a mocking edge, his eyes glinting with malice under the sickly yellow light. In his hand, a gleaming pistol caught the light, its every movement exuding silent menace and control. David, his voice tense, trembling but striving for composure.
"This is the money you wanted. Now let my daughter go."
The leader stopped a step away from David, tilting his head slightly, as though weighing the sincerity of his words. His eyes scanned the suitcase before shifting back to David's strained face. The smirk on his lips widened, growing colder, as though savoring the power he held over the situation. Leader, his voice rough, cold, tinged with mockery.
"It's not that simple. We need to make sure you're not planning to double-cross us."
He raised a hand in a subtle gesture, and immediately, two of his men moved closer. Their heavy boots struck the concrete floor with resounding thuds, each step deliberate, echoing like ominous drumbeats. The shadows of their advancing forms stretched long and distorted under the dim light, giving them the appearance of predators closing in on their prey. David remained rooted in place, refusing to flinch. His grip on the suitcase tightened, his fingers numb and rigid, but he dared not let go. His breathing came in heavy, labored bursts as he fought to maintain his composure. His eyes, however, never left Sophie's. They clung to her, as though the connection alone could bridge the distance and shield her from harm. Despite the tension coiling through every muscle in his body, his gaze was steady and resolute, silently promising her that he would not fail her. The leader took another deliberate step forward, lowering the gun slightly but keeping it ready, every motion radiating quiet menace. Leader, his voice deceptively soft, yet laced with threat, every word weighted.
"Put the suitcase on the floor, then get on your knees. Tell me, do you really think I'm stupid enough to believe you came here without a plan?"
The henchmen circled closer, each step deliberate, predatory, their eyes fixed on David like predators closing in on wounded prey. The air in the warehouse grew heavier, suffocating with tension. Every sound seemed to stretch unnaturally, from the scuff of their boots on the concrete floor to the faint creak of rusted metal beams overhead, all merging with the eerie whistle of wind slipping through the cracks in the old, decrepit structure. Outside the warehouse, the icy wind from the docks howled relentlessly, carrying the salty sting of seawater that slapped against Emily's face. Her body trembled, but her gaze never wavered from the dilapidated structure ahead, the place where Sophie was being held. Beside her stood Sarah, her closest friend, and an FBI agent Emily had called upon for help. Dressed in a black tactical vest, her hair tied tightly back, Sarah's sharp eyes scanned every shadow and corner of the area. The handgun holstered at her side was a stark reminder of how quickly the situation could spiral into violence. Mark, the leader of the FBI team, was nearby, issuing orders into his radio. The glow from the tablet in his hands illuminated his tense features, underscoring his intense focus. But Emily approached him, her voice shaky yet laced with a fierce resolve. Emily, her voice pleading, but firm.
"Please let me go in. Sophie needs me. I know how to keep her safe."
Mark looked up, his eyes clouded with hesitation. Before he could respond, Sarah stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder. Sarah, her voice steady, persuasive.
"Mark, I'll go with her. Emily has her reasons, and I'll make sure she doesn't jeopardize the operation. This is the only way to keep the kidnappers from suspecting anything."
Mark frowned, visibly wrestling with the decision. But the unyielding determination in Sarah's gaze and the desperate urgency in Emily's voice left him no choice. After a moment's pause, he exhaled heavily and signaled the team to hold their positions, maintaining a safe distance to avoid compromising the plan. Mark reluctant but firm.
"Fine, Sarah, you're responsible for Emily, but remember, everything stays under our control. If anything goes wrong, we intervene immediately."
Sarah nodded, her eyes locking with Emily's. Sarah, gentle but resolute.
"Emily, listen to me. Stay with me and do not act recklessly. Do you understand?"
Emily drew a deep breath, nodding as she clutched the hem of her jacket tightly, grounding herself. Sarah pulled her handgun from its holster, giving it a quick check before motioning for Emily to crouch low and follow her. The two slipped into the warehouse, moving cautiously, each step calculated to avoid making a sound. Stacks of large crates were haphazardly piled, forming makeshift walls that made the already oppressive space feel even more confined. Sarah led the way, her movements fluid and deliberate, every step exuding a quiet confidence. The faint gleam of her gun caught the dim light from the overhead fixtures, her posture taut and ready, like a panther stalking through the shadows. Emily trailed close behind, her hands gripping her jacket tightly as if to steady herself. Each step she took seemed agonizingly loud in her own ears, the faint scrape of her shoes against the concrete floor echoing in the silence like a warning bell. Her breaths came quick and shallow, each one carefully suppressed, as though even the smallest sound could shatter their fragile concealment. Without turning her head, Sarah raised a hand, her fingers spread in a silent signal to halt. Her voice came in a whisper, low but commanding, imbued with both reassurance and caution. Sarah whispering, glancing back slightly.
Noise. They're distracted with David inside.
Emily nodded, her eyes fixed on Sarah's silhouette ahead. The anxiety in her expression remained, but it was now interwoven with a fierce determination. Step by step, she pressed forward, deeper into the warehouse, where the dim light from the hanging bulbs filtered through gaps between the crates, casting flickering patterns on the floor. The faint beams of light played across her face, accentuating every taut line of tension. Sarah suddenly froze, tilting her head slightly as a faint sound emerged from the far end of the warehouse. She raised her hand again, signaling Emily to stop. The two quickly ducked behind a rusted container, its surface corroded and reeking of metal. It was their only cover, shielding them as they observed the scene ahead. From their hiding spot, Emily could hear David's voice, strained and uneven, along with the harsh, guttural tones of the kidnappers. She leaned forward slightly, straining to catch every word, but the knot of unease in her stomach only grew tighter. Emily whispering, her voice trembling but desperate.
Sophie, where is she? I need to know if she's safe.
Sarah placed a firm hand on Emily's shoulder, her gaze sharp yet reassuring. Sarah whispering, firm and calm.
Stay calm, Emily. Trust me, I'll find a way to get closer, but you have to promise me. Don't move until I give the signal. We can't afford to blow this.
Emily pressed her lips together tightly, her hands gripping her jacket until her knuckles turned white. Fear and uncertainty clouded her eyes, but she gave a small, reluctant nod. She knew Sarah was doing everything to keep the situation under control, but the thought of Sophie kept clawing at her heart, tearing her apart from the inside. Sarah adjusted her grip on her gun, took a steadying breath, and began moving further into the warehouse. Her steps were confident, but whisper-soft, her figure quickly blending into the shadows and disappearing behind the towering stacks of crates. Emily stayed crouched, keeping low to avoid detection, her eyes fixed ahead. The faint yellow glow from the overhead lights reflected off the crates, creating an eerie interplay of light and shadow. Her chest tightened with each passing moment, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her like a vice. But amid the fear, the image of Sophie, fragile but burning brightly in her mind, drove her resolve, giving her the strength to wait. Outside the warehouse, the FBI team maintained their positions, their weapons drawn and ready. Mark stood beside a tactical van, his tense eyes glued to the monitor in his hands. His voice came through the radio, measured but firm, a reminder of the high stakes at play. Mark over the radio, his tone sharp and commanding.
Teams 1 and 2, hold your positions. Wait for Sarah's signal. No action until Emily and David are clear.
Emily couldn't hear his words, but she could feel the pressure of the moment weighing on every second. She took another deep breath, her eyes locked on the shadows ahead, where she imagined Sophie waiting, her daughter's presence like a flickering flame in the freezing darkness, a beacon she refused to lose. The tension in the warehouse was so taut it felt like even the smallest sound could unleash an uncontrollable storm, like a string pulled to its breaking point, ready to snap. Emily pressed herself tightly against the cold metal surface of the large shipping container, her body hidden in the shadows. Her breaths were slow but heavy, each one reverberating in her chest like an unrelenting drumbeat. David stood in the open, face to face with the gang's leader. His expression was a mix of steadfast resolve and barely concealed tension. Emily shifted slightly, trying to get a clearer view, but her foot brushed against a small wooden fragment lying on the concrete floor. The sound was faint, but in the oppressive silence of the warehouse, it rang out like a blaring alarm. One of the gang members, standing closest, spun around with predatory precision, his movement as sharp as a hunter sensing prey. His cold, calculating eyes glinted dangerously as they scanned the darkness, landing squarely on Emily's hiding spot. Gang member shouting, his voice a guttural snarl, brimming with menace.
"Someone's here. Stay sharp."
He drew a pistol from his waistband in one swift, practiced motion. The metallic glint of the weapon caught the dim light above, sending a blinding flash across the shadows. The sharp, metallic clack of the gun being cocked echoed through the warehouse, a chilling sound that carried the weight of a death sentence. David's head snapped toward the commotion, his eyes darting between Emily and the armed man. In that instant, he recognized the immediate danger. Without a moment's hesitation, driven by sheer instinct, David surged forward. David shouting, his voice raw with desperation.
"Emily, get down."
His body launched itself toward her, a living shield of flesh and bone propelled by love and terror. His hands reached out, shoving Emily forcefully out of the line of fire. She tumbled to the cold concrete floor, her shoulder slamming into the container with a heavy thud. A gunshot cracked through the air, deafening and brutal, shattering the tense silence with a sound that seemed to shake the entire warehouse. The sharp smell of gunpowder filled the space. David staggered mid-motion, his body jerking to a halt, as if struck by an invisible force. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. His hand flew to his chest, clutching the wound where the bullet had pierced through, leaving a gaping, bloody hole. The pale blue of his shirt darkened as blood spilled out, spreading like a crimson bloom against the fabric. His eyes widened, first in shock, then in searing pain. His knees buckled slightly as he stumbled backward, his breath hitching in short, ragged gasps. Turning his gaze toward Emily, who lay sprawled on the floor, his expression softened, filled with heartbreak and unspoken apologies. Emily screaming, her voice raw and agonized.
"David? No."
David wavered, his legs trembling under the weight of his failing strength. He fell to his knees, one hand pressing against the floor for balance as his blood pooled around him. He tried to steady himself, his movements sluggish and weak, but his strength was rapidly slipping away. David, his voice faint, trembling with guilt and sorrow, his eyes glassy.
"I'm sorry, Emily. I'm so sorry."
His body gave out, collapsing fully onto the cold concrete. His hand remained pressed against his chest, as if trying to stem the tide of blood that wouldn't stop flowing. Emily scrambled to her feet and rushed to him, her hands trembling as she cradled his head in her lap. Tears streamed down her face, falling onto David's ashen skin. Her sobs broke through her lips in desperate, uneven gasps as she clutched him tightly. Emily crying, her voice breaking with anguish.
"No, David, don't do this. Don't leave us. Please, please wake up."
But David didn't respond. His eyelids fluttered briefly, his gaze unfocused, before slowly closing. His breathing became shallow, fragile, like the faint flicker of a candle fighting against the wind. The space plunged into an eerie, oppressive silence. The cold wind continued to whistle through the gaps in the warehouse walls, blending with Emily's muffled sobs. On the icy floor, the shadows of her and David stretched long under the pale yellow glow of the hanging lights, painting a sorrowful tableau of sacrifice and love in the face of utter despair. A loud crash shattered the suffocating silence of the warehouse as the FBI team stormed in, breaking through the heavy doors with forceful precision. The booming impact reverberated through the vast space, mingling with the rapid cadence of their boots pounding against the cold concrete floor, like an urgent drumbeat propelling them forward. Sharp, commanding shouts pierced the tension, cutting through the chaos alongside the crisp, deafening crack of gunfire. Beams of light from the flashlights mounted on their weapons sliced through the shadows, illuminating panicked figures scrambling for cover behind towering crates. Mark shouting, his voice echoing with authority.
FBI, drop your weapons now. Don't move.
The criminals froze in panic, some firing sporadic, desperate shots that ricocheted off the walls and sent sparks skittering across the floor. The sharp sound of bullets hitting the concrete clashed with the overwhelming commotion. A few of them tried to flee, but agents stationed at the exits quickly subdued them. The metallic clink of handcuffs snapping shut punctuated the angry, helpless screams of those who had been captured. Emily, pressed against a corner of the warehouse, barely noticed the chaos. Her mind was consumed with one overwhelming thought: finding Sophie. Her eyes darted frantically across the dimly lit space, scanning every shadow, every movement for the tiny figure she had waited so long to hold again. And then, in a dark corner near a stack of containers, she saw her. Sophie was bound hand and foot, her small body huddled on the freezing concrete floor. Her frail shoulders shook with fear, and her tear-streaked face reflected exhaustion and terror. Her wide, innocent eyes stared vacantly at the chaos around her, too frightened to comprehend what was happening. Emily didn't hesitate. She bolted towards Sophie, her trembling hands working furiously to untie the rough knots binding her daughter. Each loosened rope felt like a tiny victory. Each breath Emily took filled with equal parts urgency and love. Emily sobbing, her voice breaking with relief.
Sophie, are you okay? It's okay now, sweetheart. Mommy's here. Mommy's here.
Sophie broke into tears, the sobs she had held back all night finally escaping in an uncontrollable flood. She threw herself into Emily's arms, clinging tightly as though her mother's embrace was the only thing anchoring her to safety. Sophie buried her face in Emily's chest, seeking comfort and warmth. Sophie sobbing, her voice fractured by fear.
Mommy, I was so scared. They took me, Mommy.
Emily stroking Sophie's hair, her voice trembling but soothing.
It's okay now, my love. You're safe. I won't let anyone hurt you ever again.
As Emily held Sophie close, time seemed to pause, the noise around them fading into the background. But her relief was short-lived. She turned her head, her gaze searching anxiously for David. She found him not far away, lying on the cold floor. His hands were pressed against his chest, where blood had soaked through his white shirt in a deep, spreading stain. His face was pale, his lips tight as he struggled to breathe, each gasp more shallow than the last. Emily rushed to his side, pulling Sophie with her. Kneeling down, her hands trembled as she cupped David's face, lifting it gently. Emily sobbing, her voice breaking apart.
David, are you okay? Please stay with me. Sophie and I need you.
David slowly opened his eyes, the faintest glimmer of relief flickering in his gaze when he saw them both safe. A weak, fleeting smile crossed his lips as he mustered the strength to speak. David, his voice hoarse, faint but resolute.
I'm fine. You and Sophie, you're safe now.
Emily turned toward Mark, her voice trembling but filled with determination. Emily pleading but firm.
Mark, call the medics now. David needs help immediately.
Mark nodded sharply, signaling the medical team. Their hurried footsteps echoed through the warehouse as they rushed toward David with the stretcher. The medics moved quickly but carefully, assessing his injuries with practiced precision. Medic calm, professional.
He's stable but losing a lot of blood. We need to get him to the hospital right away.
David reached out, his hand grasping Emily's weakly. His gaze, though pained, was filled with love and trust. David whispering, his voice heavy with emotion.
I am sure, Ajay. I'm not leaving you or Sophie, I promise.
Emily leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead, her tears falling freely but carrying a flicker of hope. Emily softly, her voice trembling.
I believe you. You're strong, David. Sophie and I will always be by your side.
As the last of the criminals were led away in handcuffs, the air in the warehouse began to shift, the oppressive tension lifting slightly. Yet the weight of the night still lingered. Emily knelt beside David, her hands tightly gripping his, as though willing her warmth into him. Sarah approached, her face damp with sweat from the confrontation but her demeanor steady and composed. She crouched beside Emily, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Sarah, her voice soft but steady.
Emily, it's over. They've been caught. Sophie is safe and David will be okay.
Emily lifted her tear-filled eyes to meet Sarah's, biting her lip as she fought to hold herself together. Her voice trembled as she spoke, the weight of her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. Emily choking on her words.
Sarah has hurt so badly. What if? What if it's too late?
Sarah tightened her grip on Emily's shoulder, her sharp gaze filled with conviction. Sarah firm, determined.
David is a fighter. He protected you and Sophie, and now we're going to fight for him. But we have to act fast. He needs us now.
Emily nodded, inhaling deeply to steady herself. She turned to Sophie, who was being comforted by an agent nearby, and called gently. Emily softly.
Sophie, sweetheart, come here.
Sophie ran to her mother, her tear-streaked face still trembling with fear. Emily wrapped her arms around her daughter tightly before looking back at Sarah. Emily urgent but resolute.
All right, get him to the ambulance. We can't waste another second.
Sarah nodded and stood, signaling the medics. She paused for a moment, her eyes meeting Emily's with a mix of admiration and reassurance. Sarah with a small, encouraging smile.
You're stronger than you think, Emily. David is lucky to have you.
Emily watched as Sarah moved toward the stretcher, her steadfast presence like a beacon amidst the chaos. She squeezed David's hand one last time as the medics carefully lifted him. Her voice was barely a whisper, a promise carried on the edge of her breath. Emily softly, her voice trembling with emotion.
You have to live, David. Sophie and I need you. We'll get through this. Together?
As the warehouse doors opened wide, light from the outside spilled in, bringing with it the chill of the night air and a renewed sense of hope. The medics hurriedly carried David to the waiting ambulance, and Emily and Sophie followed close behind, never letting go. Inside her, the fire of determination burned brighter than ever. The soft morning light filtered through the gap in the curtains, its pale golden rays casting a faint glow over the stark white hospital room. The small space was simply furnished a hospital bed in the center, surrounded by a few medical monitors that emitted a steady beeping sound. The rhythmic pulse of the heart monitor was gentle yet relentless, a metronome counting each heavy, agonizing moment that passed. David lay motionless on the bed, his face pale and drained, his eyes shut as though lost in a restless, unyielding sleep. His skin was pallid, and faint bruises peeked out from beneath the collar of his hospital gown. One arm was wrapped in bandages, an IV line delivering a slow, steady drip of clear liquid into his frail veins. Nearby, Emily stood silently. Her hand rested lightly on the back of the chair by the bed, her fingers clenched tightly around its edge, betraying the storm of emotion she was trying to keep at bay. Her slender shoulders quivered faintly, but she no longer cried. Her tears had long since dried during the sleepless night she had endured. Her gaze was fixed intently on David's face, her eyes heavy with pain and disappointment, yet touched by a glimmer of resolve, as if she was silently willing herself to believe that things could, and would, get better. The room was quiet, save for the steady hum of the machines and the sound of David's labored, shallow breaths. A faint breeze slipped through the slightly open window, stirring the thin white curtains. The sunlight shifted delicately with the motion, as if trying to lend a small measure of warmth to the cold, somber atmosphere. Emily inhaled deeply, her chest rising as she sought to steady herself. She reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair from David's forehead, her fingers brushing his skin, colder than she remembered. Her eyes softened for a brief moment, a flicker of tenderness breaking through her weariness. But as her gaze drifted to the bruises and wounds marking his body, the determination returned, stronger than before. Emily whispering, her voice soft but unwavering.
"You have to wake up, David. Sophie and I need you. There's still hope for us, for our family."
She sank into the chair, her hand resting lightly on his. In that quiet moment, the faint light from the window bathed them both in a gentle glow, a fragile glimmer of hope piercing through the stillness and chill of the room. The soft morning light seeped through the gaps in the thin curtains, casting a pale golden hue over the sterile hospital room. The faint warmth of the sunlight tried to soften the coldness lingering in the space, but it wasn't enough to chase away the heavy weight of sorrow that seemed to settle in every corner. David lay motionless on the bed in the center of the room, his face waxen, his pallid skin stark against the bandages that wrapped his chest. The heart monitor beside him beeped steadily, a gentle rhythm that punctuated the tense silence, counting each heavy second that passed. A flicker of movement stirred him. His eyelids, heavy and slow, fluttered before gradually opening. His gaze was unfocused at first, disoriented by the soft morning light spilling into the room. But within moments, his eyes found what they seemed to instinctively search for: Emily. She sat quietly in the chair beside the bed, her hands gripping the edges of the seat so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her gaze was cast downward, fixed on the floor, her silence carrying the weight of emotions too deep for words. Pain coursed through David's body, but it was no match for the tide of regret surging within him. He tried to smile, a faint, broken attempt, but his lips merely trembled, unable to form the gesture. His eyes, heavy with guilt, sought Emily's, silently begging for forgiveness he knew he didn't deserve. David, his voice hoarse, trembling, each word breaking under its own weight.
I just wanted to protect our family, but I destroyed everything."
Emily's head lifted at the sound of his voice, a flicker of light sparking in her eyes, like a small ember reigniting in the ashes. But the light was fleeting. Her expression hardened, and she turned away, gripping the chair tighter as a single tear slipped down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly, refusing to let herself break. Emily, her voice firm, but trembling with suppressed emotion.
"Your mistake nearly cost us everything, David. Do you even understand that? We almost lost Sophie. I almost lost..."
She stopped, inhaling deeply, as if to steel herself against the storm of emotion rising within her. Even as she fought for composure, her voice wavered, carrying the weight of wounds too fresh to heal. Emily, turning back to face him, her gaze cold yet laced with pain.
"I can't forgive you. Not now, maybe not ever. But I won't let Sophie suffer anymore because of us. We have to change, David, for her, for this family."
David froze, her words hitting him like a crushing blow. His pale lips pressed together, his head bowing low, his gaze falling to the pristine white blanket covering him. He wanted to respond, to defend himself, to promise he could make it right, but the words caught in his throat, strangled by the truth he couldn't escape. For a long moment, he remained silent. Then his eyes fluttered shut, his breath slowing, deepening, as though he were retreating inward, trying to accept the bitter reality that the bond between him and Emily was fractured, perhaps irreparably, and the road to repair it might be one he could never fully walk. Emily stayed in her chair, her eyes no longer on David, but instead gazing out the window beside his bed. The pale sunlight pierced through gray clouds, casting weak rays onto the ground below, a fragile beacon of light in an otherwise overcast sky. Yet inside her, an emptiness lingered, a void the sunlight couldn't touch. The hospital room felt frozen in time, suspended in a fragile stillness. Only the steady beeping of the heart monitor and David's faint breathing broke the silence, a relentless reminder of what had been lost and what little remained to piece together. The beach stretched wide under the glow of the setting sun, bathed in hues of amber and gold. The day's final rays embraced the glittering waves, which rolled gently onto the shore, leaving behind fleeting trails of white foam on the soft sand. In the distance, seagulls circled and called out, their cries weaving into the symphony of waves and wind, crafting a scene that was both tranquil and evocative of new beginnings. Emily sat on a small blanket spread across the sand, her arms wrapped gently around Sophie, who rested snugly in her lap. The little girl tilted her head, her clear, innocent eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sun was slowly sinking into the vast expanse of the sea. A soft laugh escaped Sophie's lips, bright and pure, a note of joy that lifted the quiet of the evening. Sophie whispering, her voice filled with wonder.
"Mommy, the sunset is so beautiful. Look, the whole sky looks like it's been painted orange."
Emily smiling softly, her tone gentle.
"That's right, sweetheart. The sunset is the sun's way of saying goodbye, but it also promises us a new day filled with light."
A few steps away, David leaned against a low rock, his gaze also drawn to the distant horizon. The breeze tousled his hair, and his hands instinctively rested on his chest, a subtle protective gesture over the scars of his past injuries. The golden light of the sunset bathed his face, highlighting both his weariness and a quiet radiance he hadn't felt in years. David turned to look at Emily and Sophie, a faint yet heartfelt smile forming on his lips. After months of grueling recovery, being here, on this familiar beach with his family, felt like stepping out of darkness into the warm embrace of life again. He began walking toward them, each step slow but steady. As he reached them, he lowered himself to sit beside Emily, his eyes filled with tenderness as he looked at the two people who meant everything to him. Sophie immediately wriggled out of her mother's lap and climbed into her father's, her small arms wrapping tightly around his neck. Sophie excitedly, her voice ringing with delight.
"Daddy, you're feeling better now, right? You promised we'd fly kites together."
David chuckling softly, his voice warm.
"I'm feeling much better, sweetheart. We'll do whatever you want."
Emily watched them laugh and talk, her eyes shining with quiet happiness. Despite the hardships and pain that had brought them here, their family remained whole, and that was everything to her. David turned to Emily, his expression filled with gratitude and a tinge of remorse. He reached for her hand, clasping it gently, his grip firm yet tender, as if conveying a thank you he struggled to put into words. David, his voice low, earnest.
"I've made so many mistakes, but I'll never let you and Sophie go through that again. I promise."
Emily softly, but with resolve.
"No one's perfect, David. What matters is that we're here now together. For Sophie, for this family."
They sat side by side, watching as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in twilight. In the distance, the lights of a fishing village began to flicker to life, sparkling like stars scattered across the earth. The rhythmic crash of the waves blended with Sophie's laughter, a gentle melody that marked the end of one turbulent chapter and the hopeful beginning of another. Under the magnificent twilight sky, the family huddled close, embracing the promise of brighter days ahead, united by the unshakable bond they had fought so hard to preserve. The sunset over the beach slowly faded, the radiant hues of gold and amber giving way to soft purples and deep blues. The sky grew calmer, gentler, as if drawing the curtain on a long, arduous day. The shadows of Emily, David, and Sophie sitting close together on the endless stretch of sand extended under the waning light, their silhouettes etched in delicate, steadfast lines, a quiet emblem of family love enduring and unyielding, even as the world around them changed. Sophie held tightly to both her mother's and father's hands, her bright eyes now free of fear or confusion. Emily leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to her daughter's forehead, while David gently pulled them closer, his arm wrapped securely around them, both a silent promise that they would never be apart. The ocean breeze drifted by, carrying its familiar salty tang and mingling with the gentle sound of waves lapping against the shore. The waves came and went, erasing footprints in the sand, as if to suggest that the wounds and mistakes of the past, too, could be washed away, leaving behind a blank canvas, a pristine shore ready for new beginnings. The family sat in quiet harmony, gazing out at the vast expanse of the sea, drawing strength from one another's warmth amidst the evening's chill. No words were spoken, but in the stillness they all understood they had weathered a stormy chapter of life, and now a brighter light awaited them on the horizon. At last, the image of waves meeting the shore and the fading sunset gave way to the embrace of night. Only the whispers of the wind and the rhythm of the ocean remained, a serene coda to a story filled with profound emotion, a testament to how love and the bond of family can triumph over even the fiercest trials. Stay tuned for more heartwarming and emotional family tales full of twists, hope, and resilience.